but I wanted to keep them also, in a way, recognizably individual. So at times, Saartjie's own music, of course, blends all these influences because she, in a way, blended all these influences in her own life. But yes, I think like in any opera, you also want to characterize different worlds, and each world must retain its status as an individuality which can be pitted against and contrasted to other realities.
Good morning, Hendrik. It's so great to talk to you again here on Zoom.
And the same for me. Thank you very much for doing this. It's a great pleasure and a great honor, Petra. I hope you're doing well.
Yes, very well, thank you. And a lot has happened since the last time we spoke. And I've been watching on Facebook all the things that you've been involved in. Amazing what you're doing in South Africa.
Gosh, thank you very much. Yeah, it's wonderful to be able to live in a country like South Africa, which I suppose is not really part of the mainstream of what happens in Western classical music. But yes, there certainly is enough going on to keep someone like myself very happily entertained.
Well, I've spoken to many, since we last also spoke, I've spoken to many South African artists, South African opera singers as well, and specifically artists in the classical music genre. And a lot, like you say, it's not, Vienna, it's not all the opportunities that you have maybe in Europe, but still I find the South Africans really doing their thing, really, even though they have all these obstacles, they still continue pursuing their careers and collaborating with each other and doing a lot of interesting works.
Indeed, yes. I think the people who pursue classical music in this country are all of them very, very passionate about it. And as you say, they have to surmount quite a few obstacles, but I think that only increases the passion eventually.
Yeah. But you were involved also at the University of Cape Town, but recently I know you've retired. But you were professor in composition and music theory, was it right?
That's correct. Yes, yes.
Mm. And there, did you find that also for composers in South Africa that that there's almost an opportunity for them?
Yes. Look, I think it's to a large extent having to make your own opportunities and being a little bit of an entrepreneur, something which I'm not particularly good at. But yes, it certainly makes you look for opportunities. I think probably most composers worldwide are perfectly happy just to sit in a little room and write music. But yes, you have to do something to get the music out there. So yeah, I always, every year, my New Year's resolution is to do a little bit more of the kind of networking, promoting stuff that doesn't come naturally to me, and not to always just use the fact of composing as a very good excuse not to do those things.
Oh, okay. But most artists say that, that they would prefer not having to do all those types of things.
Indeed. I think one of the drawbacks maybe of being in South Africa, which is in many senses an absolutely wonderful place to live in, is that we don't really have anything like an agent for classical composers. So it would be lovely to be able to say to someone, you get this commission on anything that I do, and you do all that work that I am so bad at doing myself. But unfortunately, I haven't yet encountered anyone who does that in South Africa.
Mm.
And also, sorry to interrupt you. I've often thought about maybe approaching an overseas agent, but I don't think they're really interested in someone who's actually living in South Africa. It's so far off the circuit that they can't really promote you in person and say, okay, come to this cocktail party or come to this concert or whatever, because you are miles and miles away. So I don't think there is necessarily that much interest from that side either. So yes, you end up having to promote yourself more or less.
But I read that you are the most performed composer in South Africa.
Well, I have been told that, and by the then chair of SAMRO, which is the South African Music Rights Organization, so I had to take her word for it.
Okay.
I suppose every composer kind of feels that they would love to have a lot more of their work performed. But yes, if that is indeed the case, I'm very privileged to be in that position. That was some years ago, so I'm not quite sure that it's necessarily so true today. But yes, I certainly have had a lot of performances, and I'm very, very grateful for that. And I've written quite a lot. I think Veronica Franke, who also is in South Africa, recently in the Musical Times called me probably the most prolific composer in South Africa, which again is not necessarily that you're being performed that much, but certainly that you do write quite a lot of music.
Oh, okay. But you write, and I didn't know this, but you also wrote ballets. Is that true?
Yes, although my ballets have been, I think, a bit of a sad story for me. I wrote a 3-act ballet on the Alice books by Lewis Carroll, but that was at the time that I was transferring back from Italy to South Africa to take up a post at the University of Stellenbosch. And there were all kinds of shenanigans that went on there. And in the end, the ballet never got performed. The person who was meant to conduct it turned out to be a fellow composer who had kind of hoped to be the composer for this commission.
Oh, I see.
And so it was for me, yes, rather a sad experience. Also, having just come back to South Africa and trying to establish yourself as a composer, to be faced with that kind of antagonism was kind of devastating. So it took me quite a few years to just get over that.
Really? Mm. And also opera, you composed for opera, and then there was something on YouTube that I saw performed that you wrote as well, The Broken String.
Yes, indeed. The Broken String.
It's so beautiful.
It's a beautiful text, which of course comes from the Khoi heritage. In fact, the Khoi San heritage is what we generally call the Bushman, and it's a lovely lyric, really, to a Bushman song that was transcribed by a gentleman, William Bleek, who lived in the Cape in the 19th century and transcribed a lot of the folklore of the Bushman laborers that were employed in the building of the Cape Town harbour. So he kind of almost invented the ethnographic notation in written language of the Bushman languages that he encountered. These were then transcribed into English and form part of the William Bleek collection, which is housed at the University of Cape Town, and which contains, I think, many, many wonderful, I wouldn't call them poems in the Western sense. They are really lyrics to what those people sang, and which I think was very often partly part of their tradition, but also sometimes songs which they themselves made up or composed, if you like. And it has been used by a great many South African artists in the visual arts, in the written words, in composition as well. I took the original text and slightly adapted it to make it, I suppose, more something that one can insert into a kind of Western genre. But I did try to convey something of the atmosphere and the emotions that the text itself and the tragic history of the Bushmen suscitated in me. And then in the end, it actually became an aria or a song sung as a song in my opera Sara Baartman, when Sara Baartman, who of course was known as the Hottentot Venus, went to London and did a show there. She, in fact, sang in this show as well, and sang in various indigenous languages. And I just said, okay, well, perhaps she also sang something of the Bushman tradition. And yeah, she was reputed to have accompanied herself on the ramki, which of course is a traditional South African instrument as well. So the accompaniment itself kind of, even in the original song, before I'd even thought of Sara Baartman, had suggested something like a ramki. And it transferred, I think, quite smoothly into the opera, as in the song that she sings on stage there.
But so beautiful.
And that opera was Thank you so much. No, I think that opera was done very shortly after we last spoke. I retired from UCT at the end of 2022, and Sara Baartman was performed in my last semester at work at the Baxter Theatre. And yes, I think it went extremely well. It was conducted by the wonderful Jeremy Silver, who is now the head of Cape Town of the Opera School at UCT. And I think they now call themselves UCT Opera. They used to be the Opera School, but I think it's UCT Opera now. And he does wonderful work. We have so many great voices and wonderful singers there that it's always a pleasure to hear them and to work with them.
But it's so beautiful that you use where you are, the stories from where you are. I just recently spoke to an artist from Nigeria, and we talked about this exact thing, that art needs to tell the stories from where you are, from your experiences, but also from your environment. And this, the Sara Baartman story is such a very sad story about the history of South Africa.
Indeed. And I think also an immensely complex story. I think that's what attracted me to the story in the first place, and to trying to discover something about this rather enigmatic woman, who is often, of course, seen as kind of, if you like, the poster girl of African victimhood, which in many senses she was, but she was also an incredibly enterprising person, and very clearly had a mind and an opinion of her own. For example, I think many of us grew up with the idea that she was kind of exhibited in the nude in London against her will. And the more I researched her history, the more I found out that this was very far from the truth. She, in fact, refused to take off all her clothes. She did all her shows in a full-length body stocking from her toes to her neck. And she wore, over that, she wore traditional Xhosa garb, sorry, not Xhosa garb, Hottentot garb, as they were then called. Of course, nowadays we call them the Khoi, but that was why she was known as the Hottentot Venus. And yes, she was very much more in command of her own destiny than we have been led to believe. And I came to the realization that in a way she is being victimized again by being portrayed by our contemporaries as a kind of mindless piece of human flesh that was just being moved around by other people. That is definitely not the truth. We don't know the whole truth. She left almost nothing in her own words. But what we do know is that the two posters that advertised her show in London have at the bottom in the fine print, copyright Saartjie Baartman.
Really?
So she was, in fact, also the first South African publisher in London.
Wow.
And when the abolitionists at that time, of course, they were trying to stop slavery, and they were basically working from London, and they saw Sara Baartman's case as a golden opportunity to highlight the plight of indigenous people. But then when they got the court to approach her and to free her, if you like, from these people who were ostensibly using her, she said, "Thank you, but no thank you. I live in a luxury mansion in Piccadilly. I go for drives in a coach on Sundays. In Cape Town, I was extremely poor. I was a servant girl in the house of freed slaves, earning a pittance, and here I live almost like royalty. So why would I go back?" In fact, she showed them a contract. Of course, all this is also being disputed, but I mean, she did show them a contract which said that 50% of the royalties of the show went to her, which, of course, for any showgirl anywhere in the world would be astronomical. So I don't have the answers about Saartjie, but I think it is a far more complex story than we have been led to believe. And, of course, wonderful material for an opera because you can explore all these contradictions and complexities.
Yes, yeah. Well, you just telling me something that I really didn't know. I thought I was also under the impression that it was sort of she was a victim, and
Look, she definitely was a victim also. After the shows in London, and she went to London with a Scottish doctor from the Cape, who thought it might be a way for her and himself, of course, to make money. But he got the idea because Saartjie had already been living in in Cape Town for 10 years and had been making a bit of money on the side by doing shows for British sailors. So she had kind of discovered this market for herself. And he then just became her partner. And she, in fact, insisted that the people in whose house she was a servant, where she was also really a kind of family friend, she insisted that Hendrik Caesar, who was, if you like, her master, should come along to London. And she said she wouldn't go without him. So she made all kinds of conditions and kind of was, I think, more in control of her destiny than we had been led to believe. In fact, things started going wrong, I think, more dramatically for her once Hendrik, who was, of course, married, wanted to go back to the Cape. And then she went to Paris, and there, I think, got into the hands of a more disreputable kind of manager. Some people allege that he made her into an alcoholic and exploited her. Some people even allege that she turned to prostitution. But there's absolutely no proof of any kind. I suppose it's all part of this mania to turn her into the ultimate victim. So that she was diagnosed, I think, with a kind of addiction to alcohol. So that is certainly true. But there's no evidence that she ever prostituted herself. In fact, the evidence we do have is of the contrary type. There was a group of scientists, and this also comes into the opera, at the Jardin du Roi, which was the kind of natural history museum in Paris. They wanted to draw her because of her anatomy, which to them was very exotic. But even there, when they wanted to make drawings of her completely naked, she said no. She said, there are parts of my body that are only for someone that I love and not for public consumption, if you like. So again, that doesn't sound to me like the words of a prostitute. You know, that sounds like someone who has her own ideas of what is dignity and what is okay, and kind of sticks to them. So yes, I just thought here's someone who really is a far more complex personality. She was also definitely not an innocent girl from the bush, as we had been led to believe. She stayed in Cape Town for 10 years, as I said, after having come from a farm in the Eastern Cape. And she had three children by three different men. Unfortunately, all the children died. But yes, she was also already in her 30s when she went to London, not the sort of innocent girl that we all seem to believe she should have been. So I think she was a far more complex and complete woman than we had been led to believe. And I want to kind of celebrate that in this work. And also say, you know, how dare we, coming from a kind of Western colonial tradition, impose our moral values on someone who doesn't come from that tradition? Exactly. Why should it be immoral for her to be proud of her body and to, if she can turn a quick buck, why not? It's always like a form, nowadays they talk a lot about economic migration. Well, she was one of the first economic migrants. She thought there was a better life for her in London than there had been in Cape Town, and without any doubt there was. Of course, there was, I think, from the European side, also a salacious and seedy element to the whole thing. She was billed as a kind of ethnographic exhibition, which was very fashionable at that time. They would bring indigenous peoples from across the world, and then they would kind of, show Londoners what they're all about and sing a little song and do a little dance from their culture and so on. But there was also, obviously, I think, a lot of people who went to see her show simply because of her very pronounced anatomy, which was kind of celebrated in literally hundreds of songs and cartoons and poems in the press. So when she died in 1815, she was by far the most famous South African that had ever lived.
Really?
I think all those things need to be put on the table as well.
Exactly.
Of course, she was a victim, and she died in tragic circumstances at a young age, and definitely partly because of the alcohol addiction, but also because she had suffered a disease while she was in Paris. They're not quite sure, it's something to do with the lungs. So the opera does go up to the night of her death, which, according to legend, was on New Year's Eve, but actually they've since discovered it was a few days later. But I use that New Year's Eve moment when she's coming back from having done a show and being by now rather disgusted with the whole thing and wanting to come back to the Cape and so on. But of course, she's also quite feverish from her illness and inebriated. And so, as we say in Afrikaans, maybe suffering a little bit from dronkverdriet. She's feeling sorry for herself, and quite understandably so. But then when the cannon goes off at midnight, she believes that she's hearing the thunder of Africa, and she prays to the thunder god for mercy. And the reason I wanted to incorporate that is it's about the only extant song lyric or poem that we have in a Khoi language, which has since just disappeared. And I thought that would fit in beautifully. And then, of course, when the fireworks go off, she sees the stars of Africa and she thinks that she is back home. And the opera ends with a lot of it, I suppose, is really going on in her head rather than on stage. So she hears the voices of the forefathers calling her back and welcoming her back to Africa. And that's how the work ends.
Wow. This is so amazing. And you must have, I mean, the research that you've done is so in depth that did you need to do that to write the opera? Did you feel you had to need to do?
Look, as I said to you, I think it's very difficult to write an opera or indeed any drama about a cardboard character, which is what we had reduced Saartjie to. She was just this icon of that one thing. And then there was a very interesting book that appeared a few years ago. I don't know if you know the South African artist Larry Scully.
No.
He had a daughter, and she, together with a gentleman from America, wrote a fascinating book about which they called Sara Baartman. I should remember the title better, but it includes a ghost story, because they found it very hard to actually turn her into a real person, because there is so little evidence of what she really said herself or thought herself. But they were the ones who really upended all this mythology about her being just this one-dimensional creature, and actually did the real research that no one else previously seems to have bothered to have done, or perhaps if they had done it, simply decided not to share it with the world because it didn't reflect the image that they wanted to project of her.
Exactly.
So, yes. So, as I said, for me, she was being really kind of victimized a second time by people who had careers to make and therefore wanted to use her as their poster girl. So I think, yes, she deserved more and better than that. And of course, the opera can never be factual because we have so few facts about her, but it is an attempt to at least suggest that there are other dimensions to her and a more complex personality than we have been led to believe.
But it's also this character that you say it must make for a wonderful character to write the opera around, if indeed, she has indeed so many layers and there's so many things about her that it must be a wonderful character.
Absolutely.
In an opera.
And, I'm very much, I would say, fascinated by the idea of cross-cultural fertilization, which I think is something that happens in South Africa all the time. We are so constantly exposed to each other's cultures and constantly influenced by each other's cultures. And for me, she became almost a kind of emblem of that, because she was obviously born Khoi, but on a farm of Afrikaners, so she very soon spoke Afrikaans fluently. She went to Cape Town very soon after the British took over Cape Town, so she learned English there. And then when she went to France, she learned French as well. And in her show, she was said to have sung indigenous melodies of the Khoi, but of course, where she lived in the Eastern Cape, they were also right next to the Xhosas. So, in fact, in the opera, just before she dies, she reminisces about one of the babies she'd lost in the Cape, and she sings a lullaby to it. And the lullaby I chose was Tula Tu. Tula tu, tula sana, tula ta. Which, of course, she could have heard in the Eastern Cape if it already existed at that stage. We'll never know. But the last scene of the opera is, in fact, almost like a kind of musical interpretation of her multifaceted and multicultural heritage. So before she sings the Tula Tu, and she's thinking of the man she had the longest relationship with in the Cape, which was a Bavarian drummer boy whose name unfortunately also happened to be Hendrik. So I had to start giving new names because otherwise almost everyone in the opera, including the composer, would be Hendrik. So I called him Daniel. At a certain point during the festivities for New Year's Eve, she hears a march approaching and she thinks that he is playing the drum. And later on, she then sings what again could have been a song that you might have heard either in the Eastern Cape or in Cape Town, Al lê die berge nog so blou, which of course is an Afrikaans folk song.
Yes.
Because in some of the written reports about her show in London, it says that she also sang a rather melancholy song in Kitchen Dutch, which of course was what Afrikaans was called back then.
That is Afrikaans then. I get goosebumps all the way you're talking about this opera. Sounds amazing.
So yeah, and of course, I try to bring in the French influence as well. So during the New Year's festivity, when the marches approach, they actually sing the Marseillaise, which, interestingly enough, was actually banned in France that very year because, of course, they'd reinstated the monarchy. But I thought, okay, a lot of drunken people on New Year's Eve are not going to be worried particularly about whether it's banned or not. So they sing it, but then she kind of joins in with them from her room where she's hearing it. But she also inveighs against them saying, you talk about freedom and all that. And what about me? How free am I here? I am a creature. I have become a creature of your fantasy, this kind of wild woman from Africa. So, yes, there's also some bitterness there, but again, kind of bringing in her French culture. At some point, the revelers also sing a little ditty about the L'Avenue Hottentot, in other words, what they would have called her. And again, this makes her, at that stage of her life, very cross because she is now fed up with having to give this show and she wants no more of it. She wants to be back in the Cape. So yes, all of those things kind of, working together and against each other within this very complex personality.
Did you see the whole story? I mean, you know the history behind it, but did you see already in your head the whole story and then the music came? Or how do you work? How does the inspiration come for the music then?
Oh, look, it had quite a complex genesis. In 2010, the College of Music where I taught, South African College of Music, turned 100, and they commissioned 5 composers to each write a 20-minute opera to make 100 minutes. So it was called 5 times 20, the 520 operas. And I actually wrote what is ultimately turned out to be the final scene of the opera, and I called it Saartjie. So it was just 20 minutes long, a kind of what I suppose nowadays one would call a monodrama, just with one singer on stage, and in this case, off-stage chorus and so on. But even at the time I wrote it, I knew that I wanted to extend this into a full-length work, and that this would be more or less the final scene.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So about 10 years after that, I then wrote 3 scenes preceding that, one in Cape Town when the Dr. Duncan, the Scottish doctor, comes to her home with the idea of taking the show abroad. And then in that scene, of course, she also then demands that her master, Hendrik, who was himself actually a freed slave, should be allowed to accompany her. Then the second scene is set in London with a show in Piccadilly. And then at the moment when Macaulay, who was one of the leaders of the abolitionists, comes to interrupt the show and to demand that she be allowed to return to South Africa. And then she also then says, well, I actually don't have any intention of returning. So that is a little bit of a conflation of several moments in her London history. There was an actual court case, so he didn't just come with officers of the court as I made it out. But yes, I didn't want to have more than one scene in London, because the next scene then is in Paris, and at the Jardin des Plantes, where the main scientist of that time, Cuvier, who was a brilliant man and did a lot of interesting research on genetics and evolution, but was also a complete racist. He actually considered Saartjie Baartman to be the kind of missing link in the evolution from the ape to man, and was going to use his research to try and prove that. In fact, after her death, the Jardin des Plantes, that was his later name, sorry, Jardin du Roi, acquired her body. And you might know that they, as part of the exhibition for many years, had parts of her body on display in big glass canisters. That, of course, was completely against everything that she must have held dear, because, of course, in her traditional culture, the burying of the body in the homeland from which you come is a very important part of closure and putting that person to rest. So that was one of the things that happened after 1994 in South Africa, is that there was a lot of pressure put on France to allow for the repatriation of her remains. And that eventually, after quite a struggle, happened. So that was then the third scene of the opera, and the last scene would be then the one that was written already in 2010, which deals with the New Year's Eve and her death.
Okay. But it's so interesting that this is the story, or the more realistic story that you can say. But how was this received by the Khoi community? Because for them also Saartjie represents also another version of the story. Like
Indeed.
the victim, more the victim of this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Look, I don't think the opera really wishes to question that. I think she was a victim, and I think her end was tragic. But I think it's a far more nuanced story than the one we had been given. And I think at least what I tried to do was to restore to her a certain kind of dignity and complexity as a human being. And we were very aware during the staging of the opera that there might be resistance and that some people might find it insulting. You have to tread so carefully with people's sensibilities, and quite rightly they have sensibilities about these things. But for example, there was even resistance to the fact of my using the name Saartjie, although that was how she was known both in South Africa and how all her friends called her, and that was the person who became famous in Europe was Saartjie Baartman. But there's been a lot of pressure saying, Saartjie is a diminutive and diminutives are demeaning and we should call her Sara Baartman.
Okay.
For example, UCT has finally renamed its Jamison Hall, which was called after, one of the greatest kind of criminals and mass murderers who ever visited this country, has become now the Sara Baartman Hall. If I had my way, it'd be the Saartjie Baartman Hall, because I don't think Saartjie in Afrikaans parlance means something demeaning.
No, not at all.
There's a very well-known South African artist called Saartjie Baartman, for example. But this kind of wanting to turn her into the victim at all costs is even reflected in a book where they analyze the name Saartjie, and they say, okay, Sarah in the Bible was a servant. So little servant, and Baartman in Dutch means man with beard, which they say obviously refers to a savage. So Saartjie Baartman means savage little servant girl. Now, I would defy anyone to find a single Afrikaans person who would hear the name Saartjie Baartman and think savage little servant girl.
Yeah,
it's
really.
Just stretching things so far out of kilter that it's almost laughable. But yes, that is the kind of thing you have to deal with. And interestingly enough, even my producer, my director, Janice Honeyman, was kind of counting the number of times the libretto talks about the Hottentot Venus and saying, can we do this? But I mean, that is simply historic accuracy.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then I noted that they have surtitles. They had surtitles during the show, and although the text and the music constantly referred to her as Saartjie, they changed it in all the surtitles to Sara. So you see, that's the kind of tokenism that you have to deal with. So yes, I think it will always be a controversial subject, and one that one has to, I think, approach with due caution and with due sensitivity to people's sensibilities. But we had quite a few people of Khoisan heritage also part of the production. And, we would always run these things by them and hear what they had to say. In fact, I ultimately asked one of them, when there was pressure on me to change the name from Saartjie Baartman to Sara Baartman, the name of the opera, I said, what do you feel? You have obviously a much closer perspective on this than I do. And she said she would change it to Sara. So I took her advice and her wish and changed it to Sara. And I think if some people feel that shows more respect to Saartjie Baartman, then I'm happy to do that. Of course, within the opera, I can't have friends calling her Sara because they never did call her Sara. They called her Saartjie.
Yeah. But wonderful that you have that attitude that you don't want to provoke, or you don't want to. You take into consideration this is an artwork, so it needs to speak to people. So you take into consideration what what the Khoi community wants.
Indeed, look, she is very much an icon in the Khoi community and part of their heritage. So you obviously don't want to anger people or make them feel that you are attacking her dignity or their dignity in any way. And I think that was the very last thing that I meant to do. As I said, for me, it was more a question of restoring her dignity as a full human being rather than as just a poster girl.
But I love this. I've always been interested in the Khoi culture also in South Africa and how they started. And I've read about Saartjie Baartman as well. But I love that you used your art form to sort of tell the story and to highlight what really happened, that, and even though, like you say, it's an opera, and it's probably not 100%, it's not a history book, but that it makes you think, and it maybe start a conversation again about who she was and what she did.
Yes, that really, I think you put it in a nutshell. I always say I don't answer any questions in Saartjie. I ask questions, and just questions that I think need to be asked. We will never know the answers with any degree of truth or absolute surety, but just the fact that those questions need to be asked, I think, is important.
And when you composed the music, was there this? Did you specifically want these sounds? You know, these African, because it has to be. It's over 2 worlds or over 3 worlds, really. Or now you can say it's Europe and Africa coming together.
Yes, look, I would say the music generally is Western classical music. So all the other influences are there and form part of the fabric of the work. But I wanted to keep them also, in a way, recognizably individual. So at times, Saartjie's own music, of course, blends all these influences because she, in a way, blended all these influences in her own life. But yes, I think like in any opera, you also want to characterize different worlds, and each world must retain its status as an individuality which can be pitted against and contrasted to other realities. But from the start, from the time that I got the idea of writing the one-act first version, the idea of using different musical worlds to portray different aspects of her history and her personality was very much part of the whole setup.
That's so wonderful, and I think, I think that you used the story and you know, a South African context, that it's so informational also, you know, using art to tell the story and to tell something about the history of South Africa. But you've done also work where you combine classical music and African music together.
Yes, it's something I do, I suppose, on a fairly regular basis. Often people ask me, you know, to set a specific text or to use a specific African melody in, say, a choral work or an orchestral work. And that's always very interesting for me. I make no attempt at kind of imitation of the real thing. So I don't want to try and sound as African as possible. I think I am a hybrid. You know, I am a person of fundamentally, I suppose, Western background who grew up in Africa and from a very early age was exposed to all the different musics that we find here. Because, of course, there's not only African music, there's Indian music, there's the music of the what we call the colored population, which is a mixture of slaves from Indonesia and Khoi and white people. And black people, and all of that went into this kind of melting pot. So for me, we live in a time when a lot of people say, you know, if you are a composer of European descent and you dare to interact with African music, you have to try and be as authentic as possible. But to try and be authentic is to be acting, because I am not authentically a black person. The only thing I can be authentically is what I am, which is a white person with a great love and admiration for the music of Black Africa. And all I can really portray is my own reaction to and my own interaction with that music. So that is what I try to do. If you like, when I incorporate African elements, it's really a homage to a music which I know is not my own, but which I try to treat with affection. And I suppose for me, affection is perhaps even more important than respect. I don't expect anyone to say, I don't expect any musicologist to say, okay, now Hendrik has done this and this that would never happen in African music, but he has done, we get 2 right ticks and 4 crosses for the things he did wrong. It's not an academic exercise. It is really just my personal, very hybridized reaction to the hybrid environment in which I find myself. And I think almost everyone in the world nowadays finds themselves in a hybrid environment. We no longer live in little ivory towers where you only hear Western music or only hear African music. It's all out there, and we're all exposed to it one way or another. And I think each person has to find their own way of dealing with that and reacting to it and incorporating it into their own creativity.
Isn't it also a way of connecting worlds, or connecting cultures this way?
Absolutely. I think, hybridization is perhaps the most profound form of connecting of cultures. And of course, ultimately, it, if you like, compromises the purity of each of the cultures. But I mean, cultural purity for me is, almost like the intellectual equivalent of apartheid. It's like saying, okay, you stay in your little world and I'll stay in my little world, and let's try and keep our worlds as pure as possible. What's the point? We don't live in that world. We live in a hybrid world, and we might as well reflect that reality.
But tell me, I saw recently also you did, you wrote a clarinet concerto?
Yes. Actually, I wrote that quite a few years ago, and it was performed once by the UCT Symphony Orchestra, but it has since had another airing in Stellenbosch with one of their students playing it and very beautifully, I might add. So yes, it's always wonderful to have a bigger work performed. And of course, in a country like ours, where there are very few symphony orchestras, it's always a great privilege to be selected for performance.
So do you enjoy when people, so because if you say you wrote this a while ago, do you enjoy when people sort of revive the work, or is revive
Absolutely.
the word, but if they delve into your work and then
Indeed.
okay.
Look, I mean, you might know there's a kind of rather cliched, but unfortunately rather true opinion about most contemporary music, which is that it is performed once and never again. So it's really only when you start getting a second and a third and a fourth performance that you can say, okay, this work obviously means something to someone and might eventually become a kind of acceptable part of someone's repertoire. Because yes, the first performance, if that leads to nothing else, it can be for a variety of reasons, of course, in our world nowadays, because I think contemporary new classical music has become quite a rare thing and a thing that has very few platforms. So the fact that the work is never performed again does not necessarily mean that it wasn't worth performing again, but simply that opportunities are extremely rare and difficult to come by. But yes, for a composer, it's extremely gratifying to have further performances after the first performance.
I spoke to a young conductor who just finished or who just graduated here at the MDV. And I said, oh, wonderful. And you're going to perform at the Muziekverein. They get their graduation performances. I said, oh, wonderful. What, how does it feel to be able to perform there? And he said, well, it's wonderful, but the most gratifying is when you're invited back. And that's maybe why, what you're saying, it's that if your music is played again or
Indeed. Yes. Yeah. It's affirmation of a kind that is somewhat different to a first performance. A first performance can be the result of many things. It might be a commission. It might be a request from someone. So, yes, you write the piece, and of course you write it as well as you possibly can, and you hope that people will like it and that the performer will be pleased with it. But those are all kind of imponderables in a way. So it really is only from the further performances that you can begin to say, okay, this work does seem to have a life of its own.
Yeah. But you've also done work in France, or your work has been received there as well?
Yes. I think when last we spoke, I told you about Marika Hofmeyr, who is a remote, a very distant relation of mine. There was only one Hofmeyr who came out to what was then still the Cape in the 1700s. And I'm a descendant of him and his first wife, and Marika of him and his second wife. So we're like 7 generations apart.
Wow. And how did you get to that information? Did you have to trace the family tree?
Well, there is actually a Hofmeyr family registry and book where you can look up your own descent.
I see. Okay.
So I have a copy of that. I did look it up, but I think Marika also knew it quite well. And we actually studied together at the University of Cape Town in exactly the same year, strangely enough.
Oh, I see.
So we knew each other already, but then she moved to France and has been there ever since. She did come to do a kind of concert tour in South Africa at some stage. And then she contacted me and said, do you have anything for piano solo that I could play? So I sent her quite a few things, and she chose some and played them wonderfully. And then a few years later, she approached me about making a CD of my music, which of course was for me wonderful news. Yeah. And it also happened to just coincide with the beginning of COVID. So it gave all of us something to do. And she got some wonderful French musicians together, and they made a CD with some of my music for piano, some for flute and piano, some for vibraphone and piano, and some for violin and piano. And that CD was very well received. It got a sort of Discovery of the Month award from the leading French CD magazine, Classica. They call it Choc de Classica. You sometimes see the little sticker on CDs if you still even own a CD and a CD player. But most people don't nowadays. But in France, they seem to be quite fond still of their CDs, thank heavens. So after that, we went on to make a second CD with some of my works and some by the very important South African composer Arnold van Wyk. Marika always wanted to play his Nachtmusik, which is a big piece for piano solo. So that is incorporated on the CD together with piano works of mine and then songs of Arnold's and of mine. And that also, I think, went quite well. We were selected as Contemporary CD of the Week on Radio France in, I think, 2023. So we are now setting up a third CD for next year.
Amazing. And I love that you still do the CD thing, because I think I've got a CD player. I love the CD. Still
good for you. I'm very much for the CD and the CD booklet, which I think one misses almost more than the CD.
Yes, yes.
You know, everything is online nowadays, but you don't actually get the notes on the work and the kind of insight into the work that can afford you. So yes, I'm very much for the CD. I hope it makes a big comeback.
Yeah, definitely. No, I agree with you. The CD booklet for me is also something that I enjoy. That came only with the CD. You didn't have that even with the records, you know, when you had records.
Right. No, definitely something that we should try and keep alive.
Yeah. But you are retired now, so what do you have still more time to compose, or do you need do you need quietness, or do you need hustle to compose?
I suppose a bit of both, but it's I do miss interacting with the students, especially and my colleagues at university. That was always great fun, but of course it did sometimes come in the way of composing. So it's lovely to have longer stretches of time where you can write in an uninterrupted way. And, you know, I think I'm not the only composer who would say this to you, but composing as a creative process is a bit like going into a trance. It takes you a while to get into that special place where things seem to flow quite freely, and then you like to stay there as long as possible. So if, you know, you're going to have a student knocking on your door in half an hour's time, usually it doesn't give you enough time to really hit the spot. So it is great to be able to work a whole day or several days without interruption. And yes, I've been quite productive since retirement. On the month I retired, actually, there's a very dynamic lady here who runs the Hugo Lambert's Music Center, which is a music center for young people who do music at school, but who can't necessarily do the practical study at that particular school if they have a rather rarer instrument. So the Hugo Lambert's has its own orchestra and a wonderful auditorium. And the lady is Arisa Furgus, who's now head of the Hugo Lambert's. And the month I retired, she phoned me and she said, "Hendrik, I hear you retiring." I had by that stage already, she'd given me commissions for 2 saxophone concertos. She's a saxophone teacher herself and player. And she said, now I want to complete the quartet. So we had one for alto and for baritone. I want a soprano and a tenor sax concerto. And while you're about it, how about a guitar concerto? So I started my retirement with 3 concerti lined up, which it took me a considerable amount of time, of course, to finish. And of course, in that time, other requests and commissions didn't really stop. So I kind of had to say to people, well, okay, I can put you on the waiting list and so on. But yes, I've been quite busy writing since retirement. And of course, one never complains of that. And quite recently, I've also been approached to write some music for young people, for pianists. My old friend and mentor, Sara Baartman, who was the one when I was still at school, who convinced me that you could actually make a career as a composer, and has kind of been my muse since then. Whenever I write, I sort of think, okay, what would Sari think of this? And then go and play to her as soon as possible. But she's been saying to me, you need to write something for young pianists so that they can discover your idiom as well and your language, and not suddenly have to confront it by the time they get to university or whatever. And I always thought that was a terribly good idea, and I love the idea of writing for young people anyway. It was just always a question of fitting it in. And then there's an ex-South African pianist, Liesel Marit Jacobs, who was actually a student of mine in Stellenbosch, and she has started a publishing company in Ireland, where she now lives with her husband, and they bring out volumes of South African piano music for young people. And she had approached me also about some music. And then the third person was a girl I knew from University of Cape Town, although she hadn't studied with me, Maria Spies, also a pianist, and she now teaches in Gauteng. And she said she and her colleague there, Willie de Beer, they thought they're going to ask me to write 24 preludes for piano for young people in a kind of graded way, that goes from maybe grade 2 to about grade 7. And when she came to see me about it, it was just at a moment when I'd finished my last bit of commission and the last piece that I was working on. And I said, well, I've got a gap, and why not? That was about April this year. And I knew that Liesl Marette was going to come in August to South Africa to promote a series which is called Afri-Piano. And I thought, gosh, it would be great if we can get these 24 preludes done by then and have it on that tour as well. So that's exactly what I did. And it was huge fun. I really enjoyed writing the pieces. And, in a way, also simplifying my style, which is kind of notorious in this country for being quite tricky for the people who play it, perhaps more so than for the people who have to listen to it. So yes, writing really simple music, and music that I hope would also stimulate the imagination and the fantasy of the young people, and also in a way be a bit like a learning school in terms of different compositional techniques, different materials that the composer might use. Of course, that is really part of the tradition of writing preludes. Bach, in his 48 Preludes and Fugues, quite clearly does that. He starts with a very simple first prelude, and then gradually things become more complex, and he introduces different types of writing. So it is really, and I think he, in fact, said in some of his own letters that he was, in fact, intending not to write only a kind of handbook for the keyboard player, but also for someone who wishes to compose for keyboard. So I did something similar to that, as of course also Chopin had done to a large extent in his wonderful preludes, and Debussy in his preludes. So it is a kind of tradition that there is a kind of pedagogical element, if you like, to writing preludes. In the end, I think, manage to write 2 preludes that were grade 2 level, but then the others I thought were grade 2. Liesl Marette, Jacob said to me, no, it's definitely grade 3. She's a much more experienced teacher of young people than I am. And then instead of ending with grade 7, the last preludes, I think, are definitely grade 8 or post-grade 8. Grade 8, of course, being the last grade of the graded exams that you get from the Royal Schools or in South Africa from UNISA and so forth, and that a lot of kids go through. So, of course, after grade 8, you get licentiate, which is kind of okay, now you can call yourself a performer. And some of the pieces are, I think, pretty close to licentiate level. But yes, I then also arrange them more or less in order of progressive difficulty. So you can kind of, through your years of studying the piano, you can kind of throw in a couple of Hofmeyrs, should you feel like it, at the appropriate level.
I love that, because it's also then, I think it's also interesting for musicians to know that the composer is still there. The composer is still there. There's that contact that you are still alive. It's not like you're playing Bach.
Absolutely. My wonderful piano teacher, Laura Sill, always used to say, when we get to like something really problematic in Bach or Beethoven, she would say, if only we had a hotline and could say, Mr. Bach, what did you mean here? But yes, I think it's a wonderful thing to have the composers still around and to be able to contact them. And I always encourage people, some people I think are quite timid, or I don't know, they sort of think, we mustn't bother the gentleman or whatever. But I think any composer would be only too happy to answer any questions and to help where they can in terms of making their music as clear and as accessible as possible.
Do you have a feeling when you compose and you give it to the orchestra, is there, would you like more control? How do you sort of explain to them what you want, or do you leave it for the musicians to interpret?
Look, I would say it's a combination. I try to make my scores as clear as possible, but any musical score is really a kind of shorthand. There's no way we can possibly put everything into it that you need to make it into real music, and music that lives and breathes. So I love being invited to a rehearsal or whatever near the just before work goes on stage, and just to give a few pointers or insights of things that I would like to see that I couldn't put into the score. So yes, I think it's a great myth that, you know, if you play exactly what's written in the score, you are being completely faithful to the composer's intentions. I don't think any composer ever visualized their score being done, let's say, by a very intelligent computer who can just do exactly what is written, because there's no way you can convey all the subtle nuances and inflections and the tiny bits of rubato where you take more time or rush a little bit within a bar. If you had to write all that into the score would become illegible. It would be just so crowded with detail. So we expect people to live the music and to speak it. I suppose it's very much the same as if you took a computer and said, okay, read this poem. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? You know, we don't read like that. We read with our whole being, and that is exactly what we expect from musicians. There is, however, some weird perspective where some people think if it's modern music, then you do just exactly what's on the page. If it's classical or romantic music, you're free to make it living music, but somehow you don't have that freedom with modern music. I'm completely not of that mind, especially with regard to my own music. I always tend to put at the top of the music, if I do put a metronome mark, it usually is over quite a span so that they can take it slightly slow or slightly faster. And I always put circa in front so they must never think that it has to just go like a machine. And I often put con rubato or con molto rubato, meaning, you know, please be as free as possible. Because I think it is something that people don't necessarily instinctively do with newer scores.
But do you, I mean, previously before composers used the computer to write, so you had to write with a pen or a pencil or what on a piece of paper. Yeah, but still, do you get the feeling when you, even if you compose something now and the first time you hear the orchestra actually playing the music and it's live, do you still get that satisfaction?
Absolutely. Look, of course, it can sometimes also be a ghastly surprise.
Oh, really?
when either what you've written doesn't quite sound the way you thought it was going to sound, or when the orchestra is perhaps under-rehearsed or haven't taken their parts home, the individual orchestral members, to go and look at them. I tend to write quite demanding music from a technical point of view, but I do write for people, for musicians who take their art seriously and are happy to say, okay, we're doing a new piece. I've never seen this music. I'm not just going to expect to be able to sight read my way through it. I'm going to take the music home a few days before and look at it a bit. And usually when that happens, the results are wonderful. But yes, sight reading can be rather gruesome if you write music that isn't necessarily sight readable.
But do you have specific instruments that you love to compose for?
Oh, a great many. I would say definitely the piano, but so many others. I love, really, I would have to say of the strings, all of whom I love, I would say perhaps the viola and the cello are my two favorites. Of the winds, I played the clarinet myself, and I've always had a very big soft spot for it, but I love the flute. I've written perhaps more music for flute than for any other instrument, also because we have so many excellent flautists in this country, and they've very kindly asked me to write them things. So it's been a wonderful voyage of discovery also, because there are so many different colors and sound effects that you can make on the flute, more than on any other instrument of the wind family. But yes, the cor anglais, glorious instrument, the oboe, the bassoon, they're all wonderful. My affinity perhaps for the brass is less immediate. I tend to write more for the brass in an orchestral context, but I also tend to use the brass fairly lightly. There was a moment in kind of late romantic orchestration when the brass seemed to take over almost, and everything became dominated by this kind of brass color, which I thought is not necessarily unfortunate, because in some works it works wonderfully. But our brass instruments have become incredibly potent through the perfecting of the design and engineering of the instruments. So they can very easily overpower the rest of the orchestra quite easily. So the traditional proportions in the orchestra for me are slightly slanted in favor of the brass, because in a normal, shall we say, medium-sized orchestra, you would have 2 of each of the woodwinds. In other words, flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons. But then you'd have 4 horns, 3 trumpets, 3 trombones, and a tuba. So not only are they more potent instruments, they are also outnumbering the poor woodwinds already. And of course, to balance that, you have to have quite a large body of strings. And in South Africa, we don't have that luxury. So in most of my orchestral works, I tend to reduce the brass to maybe 2 horns, 1 or 2 trumpets, 1 or 2 trombones, and maybe a tuba, just to readjust that balance a little bit. But yeah, that is purely a personal preference. And I think one can write beautiful music for the brass, and music that will really only sound beautiful and idiomatic on the brass. So it's not like I have an inherent antipathy to the brass. I just haven't perhaps had as many opportunities to explore the brass as I have had other instruments. But I have written, for example, a trombone and piano sonata, which was premiered in Australia, of all places, last year.
Really?
So, and I've written a horn and piano sonata, which was recorded by a American very good horn player, Jeff Nelson, and that also appeared on a CD, I think about 3 years ago, of duo sonatas. It has my first violin sonata on it for violin and piano, and the clarinet and piano sonata as well. So yes, all instruments I think have their own magic and are worth exploring.
Oh yeah, but I never realized about what you say about the design, that it's the way the instruments are made now does influence the sound.
Absolutely, yes. They have become incredibly powerful and brilliant. So they have to be played very, very softly to not overpower the rest of the orchestra. And unfortunately, I also find that very often conductors do not take this into account. I think there's a certain type of conductor who likes to make as much noise as possible. So when there's a brass passage, they kind of, point to the brass, and the brass start going wild, and you don't hear anything else. I like Sir Thomas Beecham once apparently said, "Never look at the brass. You'll only encourage them." Which is not very kind to brass players, because I think there are wonderful brass players who are real musicians and are very intent on keeping the correct balance with the rest of the orchestra. But yes, unfortunately, if you have the wrong conductor, the brass can really let rip, and then there's nothing left for the rest of the orchestra to do.
I don't think I'll ever be able to watch an orchestra now without thinking about that.
Indeed.
But Hendrik, I love that you do also the arrangements or the composing for young musicians, because I think that's really so important. Also for them to, to see almost a future for them in playing also contemporary composers' music.
Indeed. I think it is, for many people still a big leap from the Romantic literature to the modern literature, and one which isn't always addressed necessarily by all the teachers. Some people love introducing their pupils to newer stuff, and other people are quite happy to stop at the end of the 19th century. And then, of course, if those pupils do take music further, it's a big leap for them and a big adaptation. I think we become less flexible as we grow older, and that's true even, I think, in your teens. If you introduced to modern sounds and modern music by the time you're 6 or 7 years old, you make friends with it and it becomes part of your vocabulary. And then by the time you're a teenager, you're perfectly at home there. But if you're only introduced to it, as so often happens at a much later stage, then it is a problem. I think one of the good things about the graded exam system, both in the UK and in South Africa and many other countries, is that they have usually 4 categories that you have to choose a piece from, and one of the 4 categories is modern. So you have to do a Baroque piece, a classical piece, a Romantic piece, and a modern piece. And that exposes all those pupils and those teachers to a more modern repertoire as well. Of course, I mean, there has been, even if I say this as a composer, there has been a tremendous amount of hideous contemporary music as well, which I can understand people running a mile rather than wanting to hear it or play it. But yes, for me, my role as a composer is in a way to try and rebuild a bridge to people who love classical and romantic music, and to say to them, there is a way of progressing beyond that without necessarily antagonizing or alienating your audience or your performer. And I think throughout the 20th century, there have, of course, been wonderful composers who have done this. People like Prokofiev or Stravinsky or Benjamin Britten, Shostakovich and so forth. But there was a time when they were kind of marginalized by people who said, okay, the mainstream is, atonal noise music and nothing else will do. I think we are gradually, fortunately, emerging from that mythology and that gospel. And of course, if people want to play that music, they are perfectly entitled to do so. But it shouldn't be the only option to a composer or to a performer in terms of modern music.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you said about some contemporary music, because and coming from a composer yourself, you must know, because it is sometimes this idea also, or that you hear contemporary music, you have put it already in this box of it's not going to be so good. So, but yeah, there are some good ones and some not so good.
Yes. Look, I suppose ultimately it's a question of taste. So if you like seriously atonal avant-garde stuff, that's absolutely fine. I have no problem with it, as long as you don't try and say that is the only possible way for contemporary music to sound.
Yeah. But I also spoke to a lot of young conductors in all my interviews, and what I love what they're doing is having their programs sort of classical music, and then always giving an opportunity for a contemporary composer's work, and then also discussing the work, and also introducing them to the audience. And I like this new idea of having the audience also, because we talk a lot about the familiar music, the familiar classics that you want to hear and that you want to hear again and again, but that they use their programs to then also give a place for a contemporary composer.
Indeed. And that thing that you said about, having the composer actually speak to the audience before the piece is played is incredibly important. I've so many times after concerts where I had been asked to say something, people I don't know from a bar of soap would come to me afterwards and say, it was so wonderful that you said something beforehand, and it helped so much to just find a way of approaching this work, of kind of getting a handle on it, of knowing what to listen for and so forth. And I think contemporary music can be very perplexing and enigmatic and tricky. And I think we should do everything in our power to make it more accessible to people and to help people appreciate it and to enter into that world. It is a wonderfully exciting world, and I think with many fascinating worlds inside itself, which one can also discover. But people do need a little bit of help, seeing that our whole listening environment is so overwhelmed, if you like, by classical and romantic and Baroque music, which people are very familiar with and have kind of made their own and made friends with, but not nearly to the same extent with modern music. So yes, I'm all for making it as accessible as humanly possible.
Hendrik, tell me, what are the wishes now for you for the future, and now that you're retired and busy?
Look, I suppose my main wish would be to be as busy as possible for as long as possible.
Yeah.
And of course, I need to, apart from that thing of I have to push myself to do a bit more networking and promotion, I also need to push myself to make more recordings. So that's my other New Year's resolution every year is, try and get together some musicians, because we have excellent performers in this country, and, maybe just find a place where we can record some stuff and get it onto a CD or whatever. And that is really a very serious proposal to myself, because, again, it's easier to just sit in your room and compose even than to make recordings. So it is something that I need to do. And I will feel much better about myself once I've done it, or at least started doing it.
Yeah, and like you say, there's so many talented musicians in South Africa, and great if also they can be involved in these CDs, and it's almost then capturing their work as well.
Sorry, your image just froze there for a second.
Okay,
I
that's
lost
fine.
the very last bit of what you said.
Yeah, no, so it's great that, and it's true that you said that there are many talented South African musicians, and great that can also be captured then in a CD, with...
Absolutely. Yes, I think that is, again, with all the wonderful things about living in South Africa, we don't really have a recording industry in this country at all. So it is up to individual enterprise to make these things happen. And it would have been wonderful to capture as many as possible of these wonderful musicians that we have around, who so very rarely get an opportunity to be recorded. Even, I suppose, many, many years ago, the South African Broadcasting Corporation used to record South African performers quite frequently, and South African composers as well, but that has completely fallen by the wayside. So now there is no kind of infrastructure that makes recordings of what is happening in South Africa. Only individuals. But yes, all the more reason why the individuals have to step up and do it.
Exactly. Trust South Africans to do it. They will do it. I believe so. Yeah.
Right.
But Hendrik, this was so great to talk to you. And I know you live there in Gordons Bay and have a view of the sea. So
absolutely wonderful.
I hope many, many more would come from your imagination. Many wonderful music come from your imagination.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much again for this wonderful platform. Not only for my own sake, it's absolutely a privilege for me to be on this, but I think you do it for so many people, and it's so wonderful that you do. I think composers have, so little opportunity to interact with the public or to interact with an interviewer, and especially in this depth and at this length. So really, you are a national treasure. An international treasure, in fact.
Thank you. I love doing this, so thank you very much.
Great. And if you come to South Africa, please promise you'll come and visit and sit on the balcony with me and have a little drinky.
Absolutely. I'm going to do that, definitely.
Great. Everything of the very best.